What it meant to be a conservative until recently boiled down to two basic tenets: small government and a strong, moral, civil society, with an emphasis on the family. Today, there's a growing movement amongst the American right to embrace something called National Conservatism, which embraces a much larger role for the state in advancing conservative values. If these ideas catch on, they will change the course of American politics in unprecedented ways. Welcome to the AIER Standard, a production of the American Institute for Economic Research. I'm Ethan Yang. Joining us today is Sam Gregg, AIER's Distinguished Fellow in Political Economy and Senior Research faculty, who brings us a distinguished career at the Acton Institute. After receiving his doctorate in philosophy from Oxford, Sam went on to serve in a variety of esteemed institutions, such as president of the Philadelphia Society, a fellow at the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University, a fellow at the Royal Historical Society, a member of the Royal Economic Society, and many more. With decades of distinguished scholarship and advocacy for classical liberal and conservative ideas, there are few other people I'm excited to speak about the future of conservatism than Sam Gregg. Sam, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So before we talk about national conservatism versus normal conservatism versus classical liberalism, we need to define terms. Conservatism, especially in the Anglo-American context, is quite different from being like a Chinese conservative or German conservative, what have you. So before we jump into the nitty-gritty of all these different types of conservatisms, what is it about American conservatism or Anglo-American conservatism that makes it special?
Well, that's a good question, and I think there's a number of ways we can tackle that. The first thing to note, I think, is that Anglo-American conservatism is very influenced by two key thinkers. One, of course, I think, is Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke was, of course, the great statesman of the end of the 18th century. And Burke was very much a proponent of the idea of limiting government power. He was also very much in favor of things like free trade, trade liberalization, economic liberty, etc. So he fit very much into what was called the Whig mode of politics. At the same time, Burke was also somewhat of a traditionalist. He was a very religious man. He also took things like custom and the traditions that had been handed down over the centuries within the British context extremely seriously. So with Burke, you see a combination of what you might call classical liberal ideas, but also some ideas that fit much more comfortably, I suppose, in what you might call a more traditional or social conservative framework. But in all that, of course, he still also believed in things like constitutionally limited government. He believed in things like certain liberties that were inherent to human beings, etc. So that's a very different type of conservatism than you find, for example, in continental Europe. But conservatism is often associated with certain types of nationalism, where there's more sympathy, if not enthusiasm, for state intervention in the economy, in which was an attachment to what you might call throne and altar arrangements that were never part of the Anglo-American conservative tradition. So that's one stream of thought. Another stream of thought that I think has been very influential upon Anglo-American conservatism is, of course, that associated with Adam Smith and the whole, what we call the Scottish Enlightenment tradition, from which he emerges and which he is seen as being perhaps the most foremost product. And that's important because the Scottish Enlightenment and the thought of people like Adam Smith is extremely important in understanding the emphasis upon limited government, a respect for social sciences and empirical research, also a great attention to things like knowledge and the trying to understand reality around us, a certain degree of pragmatism, which is all very different from the type of Enlightenment traditions that you find, for example, in continental Europe. Because the continental European Enlightenments, things like the late French Enlightenment, were not so strong about individuality. They were very much strongly emphasizing things like the general will. They had a much more expansive view of the role of the state in the economy and society as a whole. They tended to have a very negative view in some respects of things like tradition and religion. And the Scottish Enlightenment tradition was very, very different in the way that it saw many of those different things. So those are two of the main streams that I would say have played out in Anglo-American conservatism, particularly after the Second World War, where there really wasn't a type of conservative movement at all, in which the Republican Party was seen as sort of pragmatist, businessman's party, but not particularly bound to strong ideas. But with the 1950s and the foundation of magazines like National Review, figures like Russell Kirk, people like William F. Buckley, you see this particular type of conservatism that I just described starting to become more and more prevalent on the right in the United States. Now, let's be very clear about this. What they're talking about conserving is not tradition for its own sake. It's not a type of nationalism. It's not a type of throne and altar arrangements. What they're really trying to preserve is the idea of some of these figures like Burke and Smith as mediated through the American founding. So that's a very different vision of conservatism that you find in many other countries around the world where that label is employed. It's much more in favor of limited government. It tends towards a strong appreciation of economic liberty. It's very influenced by specific Anglo thinkers and philosophers and economists. And it's somewhat skeptical of having the government involved in particular parts of society. But at the same time, it's very strong when it comes to things like the importance of family and civil society, and to a certain extent, religion as well.
And this would contrast with perhaps, I guess, pure classical liberalism, which is only concerned mostly with limiting the government and free markets and not necessarily thinking about maybe the traditional aspects. And that's why that merger in the 50s basically made American conservatism what it is today.
Yes, and it really depends, of course, which classical liberal we're talking about as well, right? Because if you look at some classical liberals, someone like an F.A. Hayek, for example, what's interesting about Hayek is that he had a tremendous respect for tradition. He talks about this in many different ways. Now, his understanding of what tradition is and why it's important is somewhat different from what a classical conservative would view the importance of tradition. But nonetheless, he thought it was significant. On the other hand, you also had other classical liberals, far less interested in things like tradition, more skeptical about things like religion, tending towards a highly limited role for government in any sector of society, whereas you have other classical liberals who are more willing to talk about certain things, perhaps as long as they occur within a certain framework and within a certain set of principles. And I think Hayek tends to fit within that mold of classical liberalism rather than some of the other ones that I just mentioned. So it's very important to remind ourselves that when we talk about classical liberalism or American conservatism, even within those traditions, there are different streams of thought, not all of which fit neatly with one another. And so I think it's important to think about the Anglo-American conservative tradition as it emerged after the Second World War and as it has proceeded up until our own time. It's not like it's been a monolithic movement that's agreed about everything, that's been on the same page about everything, whether it's social policy, family policy, foreign policy, economic policy. There was a broad consensus about these things, but even within those particular areas, there were different degrees of agreement and a certain degree of disagreement about some important things. So, for example, there was always a strain of conservative thought in America that favored things like protectionism. Think of someone like Patrick Buchanan, for example, very much an American conservative, but not holding free market views when it comes to things like trade. On the other hand, you had people like William F. Buckley, who believed many of the same things that Buchanan did, but William F. Buckley very much believed in the market and very much was committed to a broad free trade agenda. So understanding these tensions and differences within this broad conservative, the right, if you want to call it that, within the United States, I think is very important, particularly if you want to understand some of the differences and tensions that have bubbled up to the surface in our own time.
And I guess the fusion of the market liberals and the traditional conservatives was probably an alliance in reaction to what we would define as progressives, people who believe in big government, who believe in a more experimental way of looking at markets, i.e. more central planning, more experts in charge. And so it's not necessarily that, someone sat down and said, okay, this is what conservatism is going to be about, and that's my final word. It's more so these interest groups coming together, finding common ground in opposing what was believed or what was empirically like a pretty present threat: communism, progressivism, what have you. So I want to, I guess, jump in because you were president of the Philly Society, which is essentially the vanguard of the Fusionist movement, and I've identified more on the classical liberal side, and I can tell you that people like me are perfectly comfortable with the alliance with the like the right wing alliance per se, but there's plenty of people who are like, oh, like why are we associating with the conservatives, what have you? And I guess the way I look at it is like, one, I guess my values on the one hand, but also the Fusionist history, which is quite interesting if you want to get into that. But Russell Kirk pens The Conservative Mind in 1953. You mentioned Buckley. So what was it about, or what was Fusionist conservatism, which seems to be kind of like, if you want to sum up conservatism in a nutshell, like family markets, right?
Family markets, strong national defense, all these sorts of things. Well, I think you make an important point when you stress threats to the United States that existed inside the United States and coming from outside the United States as well. So progressivism and the New Deal and what became the Great Society, these were very omnipresent ideas in American society, and large numbers of people were supportive of many of these ideas. So if you're a classical liberal or a traditional conservative in 1955 America, you can't be too choosy about who your allies are, right? So the old adage, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So I think that helped to explain why some of these groups, who often would disagree with each other about some important things, nonetheless would come together because they realized, okay, we may not agree about that, but we know that those people are seriously bad and need to be stopped. The other dimension, of course, was communism. So I'm of an age where I can remember as a child the idea that there was 1/3 of the world that was controlled by communist regimes, and these regimes were not friendly to freedom, not to economic freedom, civil liberties, political freedom, religious freedom, any of these things, right? And so again, if you're an American in the 1950s and the 1960s, and you're worried about communism, which traditional conservatives were, classical liberals were very worried about communism, again, you're going to find things that you're going to move in the direction of an alliance of, rather than focusing upon things that you tend to disagree about. So when we come to our present day, we don't have the threat from communism, at least in the sense of Soviet communism and an expansion of Soviet communism that existed between the October Revolution in 1918, I should say, up until the fall of communism, at least in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union in 1989, 1990. So that's gone. And that's when you started to see, I think, some of the differences within this broad coalition of conservative and classical liberal and even libertarian and neoconservatives. All these things these things that had bound them together, when they disappeared, some of the differences between some of these groups started to become more apparent. It became apparent, for example, that many classical liberals and traditional conservatives had quite different views about foreign policy compared to, for example, neoconservatives. You had classical liberals and traditional conservatives who had different views about things like trade or even family policy or social policy. And for a while, those things were kept more or less in check because I think many conservatives of this broad fusionist movement looked at the world and said, well, we've won, we can go ahead, we can move forward, we can do some positive things now instead of being purely on the defensive. But that all broke up. Not in the sense that these tribes went to war with each other, but more in the sense, I think, that these different groups became less willing to sort of live and let live with the differences that were very apparent, became more apparent, I should say, after the collapse of communism in 1990. And that's really, in many respects, I think, what we're living through today. And it forges unusual alliances that results in people finding themselves on different positions depending on the issue. There's obviously, I think, still considerable opposition to progressivism and the progressivism that comes, whether it's exhibited through economic policy or social policy. There's a certain degree of skepticism about government, etc. But those bonds that had existed before are clearly not there now. And I also think, I don't know what you think, but I think there's also, within this broad movement on the right, there's less willingness to just accept that there are certain differences and to work together on the things that you agree with. There seems to be less willingness to do this, and more of a desire to sort of put one's definitive stamp on what it means to be on the right, so to speak, in America today. So that type of live and let live attitude that existed for a long time has clearly disappeared. And I think it explains the intensity and even the anger we find today within the forces of the right, broadly speaking, when it comes to any number of issues.
And I want to touch on, I guess, slowly transitioning to the national conservative element. The let and let live element is more so associated with classical liberalism than it might be with more traditional conservative view. And I guess that's the thing that national conservatives are so upset about, because their argument would be, we have let and let live too much, and now our enemies have hijacked our institutions. I know, for example, a lot of criticisms about Margaret Thatcher and Reagan would be, of course, they were champions of conservatism. Of course, they made their countries great. Of course, they defeated communism together. But, Margaret Thatcher listened way too much to Hayek. Or, right. So, of course, I'm sure both of us are like, okay, it's good, right? That's a good thing. But the national conservatives would just say, yeah, there's too much emphasis on freedom all the time, and post-Reagan, post-Thatcher, that's essentially where the conservative trajectory has gone. Is all you hear about is freedom, and not much talk about Christianity or family and that kind of stuff. So do you think there's like I guess an institutional reason for that? Like, is because the right has become too intimidated by the left to talk about the conservative values, or was it just the freedom elements and the market elements were just too popular?
That's a good way of thinking about it. So the national conservatives that I have talked to, and I know quite a number of them, what they typically will say is something like this, that the fusionist movement as it existed from Buckley's time up until, let's say, 2005, it was driven by what you might call classical liberal priorities, by which this emphasis upon liberty, obviously, but also a heavy emphasis upon economic issues, thinking through some of the economic challenges that were posed at the time, but also we're confronting now. So they would say, I think, that the classical liberals, who they would say were always just one part of this broad right side coalition, exerted far too much influence to the detriment of the concerns of, say, people who describe themselves as socially conservative, family-orientated, faith and family types of conservatives. They would say that social conservative ideas were given lip service. They weren't. People talked about it, but they never really did anything about it. Whereas the National Conservatives would say there was much more emphasis upon achieving some of the goals of classical liberalism, which certainly in the 20th century tended to revolve around economic questions. So National Conservatives, the ones that I know, would say, we're not trying to push classical liberalism out of the picture. They would say, what we want is for a rebalancing of the priorities and goals of the right, so to speak, so that certain concerns, whether about social questions or how America engages in the world, particularly vis-a-vis trade, are given more prominence. So it's like they're saying, we want the driver of the right to change. We're quite happy to work with classical liberals on any number of different questions where we might find ourselves in agreement, but we're not going to let classical liberals run the agenda of the right. Now, whether classical liberals have actually been running the agenda of the right, I think, is a very open question. It's not clear to me, for example, that the United States has become noticeably economically freer since, I don't know, the financial crisis, for example. It seems to me that on many different types of questions, it's not clear to me at all that classical liberals were running the show, so to speak. Nonetheless, that is the narrative that you typically hear from some of the more foremost representatives of, let's call it, national conservatism today. It's not like they're trying to sort of expel classical liberalism. They're just saying, we want classical liberalism to play a part, but not the dominant part. So we're going to see how that all works out, right? Because one of the interesting things I find is that the national conservatives, they talk a great deal about America and the American nation, etc. But many of them do seem to have a certain ambiguity about what I think is very definitional of the United States, which is the American founding, particularly as expressed in founding documents like the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution. The Declaration and the United States Constitution, I think, reflect what you might call an old Whig view of the world, right? So this Edmund Burke, of course, was famously called an old Whig, and towards the end of his life, Hayek described himself as, quote unquote, a Burkean Whig. And this is a very much a particular understanding of America, of the American founding and its political and philosophical identity, and particularly reflected the influence of what you might call the moderate Enlightenment, particularly the Scottish Enlightenment, and all these Anglo-American traditions that we've already talked about. It's not clear to me that some of the leaders and people who are speaking for national conservatism have the same understanding of the founding and its requisite documents that, say, I would have or you would have about these sorts of things. And if you push them about some of these questions, it's quite clear that they have a different take on what some of these documents and the founding means as a whole.
And so what seems, when we look at national conservatism, it seems a lot like continental, like traditional nationalism in a sense. They want a larger state to essentially enforce the values of the collective. That's why people like Governor DeSantis would revoke Disney's tax-exempt status because they challenged his political views about teaching about various types of, I believe it was slang was "don't say gay" bill, and what it was trying to do was basically ban teaching about homosexuality in like the lower levels of grade school. And so it's basically for opposing these conservative family values. He used the state against Disney, right? This is something that national conservatives would endorse but classical liberals wouldn't, because classical liberals believe in a free market. They believe that the private sector should be respected, whereas the national conservatives are saying respecting the private sector has run its course. Now the left has hijacked all the corporations, all the institutions, and now these corporations are a threat to civil society. And if we follow the classical liberal line, if we follow liberalism to its logical end, you would just kind of let that spill out until basically you have nothing left. So that's kind of the argument. So I guess there's almost like a scale of national conservatism. You have like more instinctual types like just Trump and DeSantis, and you have like the more intellectual types like Yoram Hazony and Chris DeMouf, and then you guess the more extremist type like Adrian Vermeule at Harvard Law School, who just believes in common good constitutionalism, quote unquote, which is essentially the progressive living constitution just leveraged for conservative values.
Purposes.
But the common theme is there, right? It's the state not only needs to start policing the private sector. It needs to get involved in the culture war, because if we do what the limited government types want, which is just let it happen, let freedom, let good ideas come out on top, that may or may not happen, because as they are saying right now, we are the left is winning the quote unquote culture war, and that's why the government needs to get involved, because it's a very Machiavellian way of looking at it, I guess. It's like, doesn't matter what the principles are, like, we need to get in this fight right now or else we'll lose our civilization forever. So where do you think that goes right, and then where would you see the problems in it? So
it's interesting, isn't it, right? Because there are things that corporate America, the federal government, state governments in certain states, universities, etc., are doing that I certainly don't like. Right? And, but the question to me is, okay, so what do you do about that? Now, some national conservatives, not all, but some national conservatives would say the left have had no hesitation about using institutions of government and law to push their agenda across American society into the culture and trying to shift America in a way that is very removed from its founding, from its roots, from its history, from its traditions, etc. So they would say, the left are doing it. We need to do the same. To which my response would be is, I think that's a very dangerous idea, because I'm not sure at all that the state involving itself in those questions is either, one, going to fix the problems, because I tend to think that culture drives politics rather than the other way around. And if you're not really dealing with some of the cultural questions from which many of the progressive ideas and the progressive agenda is coming from, it's one thing to say, okay, we're going to use the government to do this, but is that really going to change people's attitudes about certain things or make them rethink some of the progressive agenda that has become very omnipresent in a lot of the or at least in parts of the United States today. So that's one thing. I think a second thing I would say is that, of course, the risk when you go down that path is that you become like the progressives. Maybe you're pursuing different ideals, but you're also moving in a direction whereby you're much more comfortable with using state power to achieve ends that I would think are much better achieved by, let's call it, families and civil society operating within their own sphere, etc. And they're in some cases, they're quite willing to sort of look past the Constitution and say, well, we're not that interested in what the Constitution actually says. We're more interested in interpreting the Constitution in ways so that we can get our way on particular questions. And to my mind, that's a deeply regressive step, because when you think about it, the US Constitution, the American founding, the Declaration of Independence, is something I think intrinsically valuable about that. And if conservatives of any stripe get into the business of instrumentalizing that to achieve very particular policy goals in the here and now, then I have to think that they can't help but corrode respect for those arrangements, for those documents, for the significance of those ideas that came about at a certain period of time, which are in many respects fundamental to American identity, because that's what gives America its specific identity. It's not ethnicity. It's not a sort of particular cultural history. It's not wrapped up with a particular people, particular place at a particular time. America's uniqueness as a nation is about the ideas, the founding ideas. And I would hate to see that trivialized or pushed out the door or instrumentalized so that you can win your arguments or your policy battles in the here and now. It seems to me, when you go down that path, you're giving up some pretty significant achievements for some issues. While they may be important right now, but it's not clear to me it's worth trashing this or instrumentalizing this bigger tradition in order so that you can get particular legislation passed in the here and now. Which is that, when you think about it, it's a sort of quite unconservative move, right? Because conservatives are about valuing history, valuing the past, valuing the knowledge that's been passed on to us. They're generally not about instrumentalizing things so as to win immediately in the here and now.
And I guess part of that, I see two general camps in national conservatism. The first is the sort of just pure instinctualness. Does not really care about the founding. Just, we like these values, and it's a very natural 2 + 2 is 4 to just use the state to enforce the values.
Right.
The second one, I guess, is the more good faith one, which you're trying to describe, is that they just take a different look at the founding, different look at our history, and maybe draw a different interpretation of what it means to be American. Because, of course, the American identity is the ideas. It's not about the ethnicity or certain, like eating hot dogs or something like that. So I was listening to Yoram Hazony the other day, and he basically talked about, I guess, do you see that national conservative intellectuals are essentially trying to paint the history in a different direction? In the sense, he would look at Washington and Hamilton and say they're nationalists. And I remember in a different interview you said, of course they're nationalists, but they're a different type of nationalists. It's not a European national. It's more like we need a country, instead of a confederacy, essentially. And then he pointed to Lincoln and FDR and said there's always like an appeal to God. America was fundamentally a Christian republic, and then it became a liberal democracy post-Reagan, post the Hayekian revolution, that kind of stuff. So I was wondering what your response would be to that sort of argument.
Well, I have a lot of responses to that type of argument. The first thing I would say is that I think the word nationalism is used in a way that's actually doesn't quite represent what it meant, certainly in the founding. So in the founding, when people were described as nationalists, like Washington or Hamilton, or even to a certain extent someone like John Adams, it wasn't about asserting America against the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. It wasn't about American ethnicity or anything like that. It was about the respective powers of the federal government versus the states, mm-hmm. right? So the nationalists wanted a stronger federal government. It wasn't a matter of trying to assert a type of ethno-religious identity. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I think I would say about this is that even the way that some of these thinkers read history, I think it's quite selective. I think it's incomplete in the way they talk about many of these things. I think they paint things like the role of religion in a way that I'm not quite sure is actually true to the facts of these sorts of things. So there's no question, for example, that America is, generally speaking, even today, a more religious society than, say, many Western European societies. But there was never a blending of religion and state in the way that you saw, for example, in continental Europe, right? You didn't see anything like that in the United States. So it was like a pro-religion, but the state is not in the business mm-hmm. of establishing a religion. So that's for some people that's a subtle difference, but it's a very important difference. And as people like Alexis de Tocqueville would say, he thought that was one of the reasons why religion and liberty went so well together in America, because there wasn't this effort by the state to impose religious belief. It was just reflective of the nature of the society of the time. So that's one example. I think also the way that they read people like Edmund Burke, I mean, they sort of portray him as in this sort of nationalistic way, which I just don't think is an accurate description of either the English world or the British world at the time, the Anglo-American world more generally, or even particularly representative of Burke's own thinking about lots of different questions. When it comes to things like economic issues, well, yes, there was always from the very beginning of the American Republic a strong tussle between those who were economic nationalists and those who were much more inclined towards free trade positions. But there was no suggestion that somehow if you were a free trader that you are somehow some sort of cosmopolitan globalist or something like that. That wasn't part of the nature of the way that was debated. So these are examples, I think, of some of the selectivity of some national conservative thinkers and writers about some of these issues. But here's the problem. I think the bigger problem is that this selectivity reflects the fact that the national conservatives are less concerned about the integrity of ideas and much more concerned with building political coalitions mm-hmm. that they believe will energize the right and lead to the right assuming the halls of power, of taking back Washington, D.C., etc. I mean, they're very clear about that's what they want to do. They're unambiguous about the sort of the objectives of what they want mm-hmm. to achieve. And ideas in that scenario get subordinated to the realization of political objectives, which is a very progressive thing to do. Some would say that it's a type of Machiavellian approach to these sorts of things. It's the instrumentalization of ideas. The problem, of course, I think, is that when you lose respect, or you lose, let's put it this way, you lose interest in the integrity of ideas because you're much more concerned about affecting what's going on in the body politic. The lack of integrity, or the disintegration of the integrity of the ideas, will at some point come back to get you. Because I think that ideas have a way of either fitting together or they don't. And when you start to take certain things out of ideas and put other things in, then the ideas themselves become unstable and not particularly good at sustaining long-term intellectual movements over long periods of time. And I think some national conservatives have made the calculation, or they're willing to take the risk of doing that because they think things are so bad in the United States today. I mean, I happen to think that when you get into the business of caring less about the integrity of the ideas, or you start instrumentalizing them, in certain respects, you're removing the foundations upon which you stand. And when you do that, at some point in the future, you will fall into a big hole.
And this is what Harvey Mansfield talked about. He said the difference between a conservative and a progressive is that conservatives believe that we're never going to abolish our political enemy. And so that's why if you unleash the restraints in the Constitution so you can go out and promote conservative ideas with the federal government, you're assuming that the progressives will never take that seat of power back. Right. And so that's why, no matter how ugly things may get in private society, you don't want to cross that line of just opening up, just smashing all the precedent that keeps the government locked away in its proper area.
Well, on that point, it's very interesting that I find for two things. One is the way some national conservatives talk about rewarding friends and punishing enemies. And they always add the caveat, of course, within the confines of rule of law. But I think that once government gets into the business of rewarding friends and punishing enemies, you can't help but start to corrode something like the rule of law, and I think even more broadly, the constitutional arrangements with which America has been endowed. So that's a very dangerous thing. The other dangerous thing, I think, is that with some national conservatives, I find the willingness to invoke people like Carl Schmitt, the German 20th century philosopher, who used this language of rewarding friends and punishing enemies and thinking about the world in terms of friends and enemies. The fact that he is clearly a reference point for some of these national conservatives, and I would add some of these groups who call themselves integralists, right? So people like Adrian Vermeule, I think, would fit into this type of category. The fact that they're willing to rely upon his thought, which I think is a form of authoritarianism, is disturbing to me. It's even more disturbing when you realize that Carl Schmitt was the foremost legal apologist for the National Socialist regime in Germany in the early 1930s. He represents a whole strain of authoritarian political thought that I'd like to think America has generally avoided up until now, unlike, frankly, most continental European countries. So when I see some national conservatives and then the integralist grouping invoking people like Schmitt, or at least some of his ideas and some of the themes that were very prominent in his writings, that is a cause for worry, because it seems to me that America has so far managed to avoid that type of thinking, at least on the conservative side, on the right, from seeping into its consciousness. Now, I don't doubt that on the left there's plenty of authoritarians there. There's no doubt in my mind about that. But you don't fight authoritarians by becoming authoritarian yourself. And
you basically said what I was refraining from saying, which is, authoritarianism plus radical progressive ideas equals communism. Authoritarianism plus traditional conceptions of family masculinity sounds a little bit like the guys in Nazi Germany and running Italy as well.
Well, it reflects back to a tradition of authoritarian thought that precedes even fascism, right? that goes even further back to what you might call some of the counter-revolutionary movements that emerged in continental Europe in reaction to some of the very bad things that the French Revolution did. So if the French revolutionaries are killing kings, massacring people simply because they're aristocrats, or shutting down churches, then it's entirely understandable why people would say, well, we have to strike back against these people. They're destroying everything we believe in. So it's this authoritarian tradition, once you go down that path, it's very difficult to stop following the logic of your own position. And it's not clear to me where you draw the line in those types of scenarios, because the logic tends to drive you in that particular way. And we're seeing this happen on the left now, and I'd hate to see it gather force as a cohesive sort of movement of people on the right in America. We don't need that.
And yeah, there's definitely a lot of Enlightenment trashing coming out of the right intellectuals on the NatCon side. Just the skepticism of the systems of limited government, of using, I guess, like this Whig way of looking at society.
Right. And it's also the way that the Enlightenment is talked about. Yoram Hazony, for example, uses the phrase Enlightenment Rationalism, and he uses this for a sort of a broad stroke description of the Enlightenment. Well, of course, the reality is there were lots of different Enlightenments, and they didn't agree about everything. In fact, some of them were very, very different from each other. We've already talked about the Scottish Enlightenment versus the French Enlightenment. Very different perceptions of the world, very different attitudes towards the state, very different attitudes towards things like family and religion, very different attitudes towards things like civil society, very different about all sorts of things. And the United States has benefited, I think, immensely from the influence of the Scottish Enlightenment, not just people like, obviously, Adam Smith, but people like the philosopher Thomas Reid, people like Francis Hutcheson, who was very deeply read by the American founders. This is all more or less quite good stuff. So when I hear people on the right just trashing the Enlightenment as if it's this one big monolithic thing that looks suspiciously like Rousseau and Voltaire, it seems to me that that's not fair to the complicated history of the Enlightenment, but it also risks putting a certain tar on the type of Enlightenment thinking that definitely influenced the American founding, and a type of Enlightenment thinking that I would say was actually quite beneficial.
So to wrap up, I'd like to ask you, essentially, where do you see the future and, I guess, the off-ramp to this movement? Because you do see many of the issues that they're talking about do exist, right? You have, for example, free trade has created winners and losers. Of course, we'd argue that eventually the losers will become winners once the economy moves in that fashion. But, there still are segments of America that have lost their jobs. The jobs have either been taken by technological advancements or perhaps...
Most of them, actually.
Most of them, yeah. But, they can still say, like, okay, like, some of them are going overseas. They can point to all the various social issues that are going on, perhaps look at the academy. There's drag queen story hour in areas in California. Like, obviously, that's a whole other conversation whether that's even a problem or not. It's going on, right? There's crime in all these big cities. And so there are a lot of issues that are creating impetus and incentives to favor national conservatism. But like you said, once you establish these institutions that enable this sort of more big government style conservatism, it's really hard for that to stop. And I guess one of the more convincing arguments I've heard is that, the left is playing hardball, so the right should play hardball, and maybe you have a detente after that. I'm skeptical of that, but I heard that's one of the more convincing rationales I've heard is, just escalate, so then the other side will just freak out and say, okay, like, let's stop let's stop escalating, let's calm down a little bit. So where do you see the off-ramp, if any, for the national conservative movement?
Well, I think the off-ramp question is preceded by another question, which is national conservatism arriving at some sort of stable definition of what it actually means. So I don't know if you read the National Conservative Statement of Principles that was published by the American Conservative. And what's interesting about that is that there are things there that you or I would say, yeah, I agree with that. There's no problem with that. But they're not actually saying anything particularly new in that regard. They're not really saying very much about, for example, that's particularly new about, say, foreign policy. So, for example, they're very skeptical of institutions like the United Nations, the World Bank, the European Union. Well, so am I. But that's a long-standing American conservative position. There's nothing new about that. So there's elements of national conservatism that reflect the consensus of the past. But there are also elements that sit very uneasily with some of these other things. So, for example, the way they talk about federalism. Federalism is, of course, one of America's great gifts, American constitutionalism's great gifts to the world, and it's a bottom-up thing. But if you read the National Conservative statement, it seems like it's almost like a concession to the importance of decentralization, rather than saying, no, this is an integral part of what American constitutional order should look like and be like. When you look at economic questions, they say things like, I think it's the 8th paragraph, they say something like, well, we believe in free enterprise and we're against socialism. But then there's all this back and forth about what they mean by government intervention and whether the state should do more in particular parts of the economy. And it comes out as a sort of industrial policy position with some nods to the importance of trade, etc. That's a very good example, I think, of the instability of some of their positions. Or even things like the way they talk about the role of religion in American society. It's in some respects reflective of the fact that America has had a much more robust religious culture than many continental European countries, certainly in the modern era. But at the same time, they sort of nod in the direction of the state doing more in this regard. And these things don't fit easily together. So the question of when they get off the ramp, I think, is going to be preceded by this question of whether they're able, in the first place, to arrive at a sort of stable, coherent set of positions that they think they can rally enough people around. And at this point, I would say that seems rather unlikely. Because if you look at the statement as it says now, there are contradictions, there's certain degrees of incoherence, there's hedging of particular issues. Now, all documents like this involve some sort of compromise on the part of the signers, the people drafting it. They come up with a set of proposals, they negotiate different things. We know that's normal. But in the case of the National Conservative Statement of Principles, I don't see where this is going to end up. I don't see how they can end up in a position without actually saying things like, okay, we're against trade and open trade. We want protectionism. We want industrial policy. We want the state to do these certain things. We want to basically take the administrative state and use it. So at some point, they're going to have to decide whether they are going to be in favor of those sorts of things or whether they'll move back more in the tradition of the type of fusionist ideas that certainly, I think, were dominant on most of the right for a long period of time. And to my mind, it's very unclear where they're going to end up at this point. And maybe this is one of the reasons they keep having these conferences, because they're trying to thrash these things out. But it's not clear to me, at least listening to some of the talks online or reading some of the transcripts, that they're anywhere near to arriving at the type of consensus that they would need to assume a type of dominant position on the right.
I guess on that note, I want to ask one more final question, which is, how do you, given that national conservatism is hot right now, it's all over the place. More and more people are attracted to it. My friends who used to consider themselves more classical liberal are now starting to be like, this national conservatism thing sounds kind of cool, given all of the various issues that were outlined, whether it's the left taking over too many institutions or just this idea that perhaps the government should do more in stewarding the various values that they hold dear. How do you think defenders of the more classic commercial Republican values of essentially, the old Whig style, this very moderate, nuanced style of conservatism that's, of course, be a good person, of course, behave, but also like private enterprise and free markets and innovation are also great things, right? I guess classic American values, like stereotypical almost, right? Given that this seems like the popularity, or like this, like people just love fresh things, right? Given that this is more of the prevailing attitude, and it's being framed as this thing that was so successful that now it's got problems, or like, like the logical conclusions of it are starting to show, and that's why we need to move on. How do you how would people that support that promote it, given that it's almost like this sort of like outdated, quote unquote outdated? Of course, I don't believe it's outdated, but given that, the left's already disinterested, but now the right increasingly believes this is sort of like an artifact already. So how would we frame it in a way that's attractive to more and more people?
Well, I think this goes back to something we talked about before, which is the American founding, the specific set of ideas that emerged and coalesced at a particular point in time in history in the United States, which in many respects was a combination of some old traditions, some very long-standing traditions, but also some new ideas as well. And there's really nowhere else in the world like that. So when I talk to conservatives, young and older, who are attracted by national conservatism and some of the ideas that they talk about, one of the things I say to them is that national conservatism, to my mind, represents some significant departures from the genius of the American founding, not just in terms of the formal documents, but the spirit of the founding and the broader thinking of the men, and they were men for the most part, who brought together and came up with and developed and institutionalized a set of ideas that was so successful over the long term in making America a great nation, right? So I think that is, to my mind, people like who are call themselves classical liberals or American classical liberals or some combination of conservative ideas and classical liberal ideas. I think that is the best way to talk to younger conservatives, people on the right who are attracted by whether it's things like integralism or whether it's national conservatism, or even if it's a type of conservatism plus protectionism and a lot of economic nationalist policies. I think going back to the founding, explaining to people, re-explaining to people why it was so important, the core ideas, and how they contributed to making the American commercial republic such a strong, and I think broadly a strong force for good in the world. Why would you want to depart from that, right? So, and in many cases I discover, it's not clear to me that some of these people who are grappling with these ideas have really thought seriously about this founding and the particular constellation of ideas that came together. And when you introduce them to these ideas and you explain it in its historical context, you explain how things happened and where they developed after that, I have found that some people who are attracted to some of the national conservative rhetoric and even ideas, I think they start rethinking some of those commitments pretty quickly, because I think the American founding and the way that worked out is not just more coherent than some of these other ideas. It's much more hopeful and optimistic rather than this sort of let's hit back, which in the end is ultimately a defensive reaction rather than one that's propositional, one that's hopeful, one that's ultimately optimistic.
Sam Gregg is a distinguished fellow in political economy here at the American Institute for Economic Research, as well as a senior faculty on the staff. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Ethan.
If you liked what you heard today, make sure to follow AIER on all our various media channels, such as Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, as well as check out our website at aier.org. If you really liked what you heard and you want to support more cutting-edge research and conversations like this one, make sure to become a donor. All that information and more can be found at aier.org. Thank you.